Hi, everyone. Welcome to Stand With Us Connect. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are around the world. It is great to connect with you. We're coming to you live from Israel with Stand With Us Connect, our brand new webinar series. Stand With Us has always been at the forefront of getting Israel education to people from all around the world in multiple languages. And in these challenging times, we wanted to make sure that we can still bring Israel to you. We're broadcasting live on the Stand With Us Connect platform as well as on Facebook Live. For future webinars, the full schedule is at www.standwithusconnect.com. And of course, you can also host your own private seminar for your school, church, synagogue, college group, high school group, whatever it is. We are here for you. Today's Stand With Us Connect session is Israel's emergency unity government amid a public health crisis, and it will be led by Lahav Harkov. Lahav is the senior contributing editor of the Jerusalem Post and J-Post diplomatic correspondent, analyzing and reporting on Israel's relations with the world, including the Prime Minister's Office, the National Security Council, the Foreign Ministry, and more. Lahav was J-Post's top analyst and reporter in the Knesset for over 8 years. Lahav is an expert on Israel's domestic and international politics, having interviewed major figures across the Israeli political spectrum, and has the inside scoop on the country's top lawmakers and diplomats. International news outlets such as BBC, France 24, CTV, and Sky News have sought her insights and analysis about breaking news. So have we. Lahav was recognized for her social media reporting and named the 5th most influential person on Jewish Twitter. Last but not least, Lahav is an alumna of the Stand With Us Israel Fellowship Program for Public Diplomacy. So straight and live from Israel, please welcome Lahav Harkov. Lahav, over to you.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your Passover cleaning and preparation. I know a lot of us are getting ready for Passover when we always were able to rely on our families for it. But here's a little break, and I hope you'll enjoy it. So we're in a very crazy political situation in Israel right now, and I'm going to sort of take us back and give a little bit of an introduction about how the Israeli system works for those of you who are less familiar with it, so you can understand how we have reached the situation that we're in. So when it's election day in Israel and you go to your voting booth, your polling place, you have a little slip of paper that you get in the mail that you show, and you're supposed to bring ID. In Israel, everyone has to carry ID, so that's not a political issue like it is in the US, voter ID. And you go behind a screen, and there's a tray in front of you with slips of paper, little piles of slips of paper, and you pick out the paper that represents the party you want to vote for, you put it in an envelope, and you drop the envelope into a ballot box. So, you know, Israel is the startup nation, but we're all voting with little slips of paper. In any case, after the votes are counted, any party that got less than 3.25% of the vote doesn't get into the Knesset. That's what's called the electoral threshold. And there are, in any given election, there are, you know, dozens of parties that run. In the past decade or so, the average was around 30. Sometimes it was more than 30. Depending on the year in the election, you could have 10 parties getting into the Knesset, you could have a dozen parties getting into the Knesset. The votes are counted, and then the seats of the Knesset, there are 120 seats of the Knesset, they're divided up proportionately between the parties that got above the electoral threshold. But in Israel's history, no one party has ever gotten a majority, which is, of course, 61 or more, because there's 120 seats. So no one party has ever gotten 61 seats. The party that got the most seats ever was what was known as the Alignment. It's basically the Labor Party. That's what they were called in the 70s. When it was led by Golda Meir, they got 56 seats. But the fact is, no one ever has a majority on their own. It's never happened. And so the only way to govern is to form coalitions. And so after the election, the parties go to the president our current president is Reuven Rivlin, and the parties recommend to the president who they think should be the candidate for prime minister. Now, through most of Israel's history, the person who was prime minister was the head of the largest party. However, if someone who is not the head of the largest party, and there have been cases where it's the head of, say, the head of the second largest party, gets more recommendations, then the president can, and in all cases, the president can, and in all past cases has, appointed that person to form a government. Now, forming a government means that they negotiate to build these coalitions, and the negotiations usually take place on two lines. They're usually about policies, as in what this new government will promote and put forward, and they're also on jobs being which cabinet posts will the leading figures in the different parties in the coalition hold. There's also committee chairmanships in the Knesset. There's the job of the Knesset speaker, all kinds of things that can be negotiated as a part of the talks to put the coalition together. Now, a lot of people have asked me sort of when do you decide when an election takes place? How long do governments last in Israel? So unlike in the US where it's every 4 years and you know exactly when an election is going to be, in Israel, because you have this coalition system, it's really based on how long the coalition lasts, how long the government can maintain its majority. The most a government can last is up until November of the fourth year. So it can last close to 5 years really, but that has never happened. There's always some sort of controversial political issue that these coalition partners don't get along, and then there's another election. Now, some of you may have noticed that in the past year and a bit in Israel, we have had 3 elections. It's not really within the scope or the time that we have for me to go through every single election to explain why we had 3 this year. But in brief, I will say that in the first election, there was a majority for the right, but one of the parties on the right, Yisrael Beitenu, sort of shifted its position post-election and decided to dig its heels in on certain specific issues that the other parties on the right didn't agree with. And so they sort of shifted themselves over to the left, or what you really is the center left, over the course of sort of these 3 elections, and that sort of shifted the balance, I guess you could say, and made it harder to form coalitions at first. So I'm going to talk about the parties, the major parties that ran in these last few elections, and then we'll get into what's happening right now, which is that finally, after 3 elections, there seems to be a breakthrough and a move towards an actual government, an actual coalition. So the 2 main parties that ran in these 3 elections in the past year were the Likud party and Blue and White. Now, Likud is a veteran party in Israeli politics. It basically existed in some form since the establishment of Israel. So at first there was a party called Chirut, and then over the years it joined up with a couple of other parties and it became the Likud. The first prime minister from Likud was Menachem Begin. He was elected in 1977 after 29 years of sitting in the opposition. And for the majority of the years since 1977, Likud has been in power. Not all the years, but most of them since then. Now, Likud is considered the sort of main right-wing party. In Israel, when people talk about right and left in politics, there's a range of issues, of course, that Israelis care about, but the right and left these days in Israel is generally defined by sort of diplomatic and security issues, whereby the right is less likely to concede, to be willing to make concessions towards some kind of peace treaty with the Palestinians. It's not to say that they don't want peace, but they don't want to make concessions of land. And on the left, they are more willing to. On the very extreme left, there's certain different views about, one state solution and things like that. But generally, on the left, they want 2 states based on pre-1967 lines. And on the right, some would be willing to entertain some kind of demilitarized Palestinian state. Many are not for any kind of land concessions, or for much fewer concessions, or a smaller scale concessions, I would say, than the left. So there's a range, and there's actually a range within Likud too, because Likud is unique in Israel, that it's one of the few parties, and in the last election, possibly the only party really, that held a primary. I think, yeah, in election number 3, they were the only party that got into the Knesset that held a primary, I believe. But they're one of the few parties in Israel for a long time that has held a primary where all of its members can vote for its leader, and all of its members can vote for who the representatives are in the Knesset. And Likud has over 100,000 members. So they're by far the largest in terms of membership. And they have sort of the most, I would say, open system as far as the members being allowed to participate in the party. Now, Blue and White is a new party. Unlike Likud, which has sort of deep historic political roots in Israel, Blue and White is new. They were a bloc that was made up of several parties. The sort of oldest part of those parties is Yesh Atid, which was formed in 2012 ahead of the 2013 election. It was led by Yair Lapid, who was a television personality / journalist who was very famous in Israel. He decided to enter the political fray, and he came from a political family. His father had been justice minister, although his father had also been a journalist before that. And he ran on a heavily secularist platform. He wanted the ultra-Orthodox in Israel to have to enlist in the military like the rest of Jewish Israelis. And he also came on an economic platform wanting to lower the cost of living. And those were 2 big issues for him at the time. The economic issues have sort of become less of a priority for him over the years, but the secularist agenda has remained. Now, there was another party that was running in the first of these 3 elections in the past year that they first entered the race, and they were called the Israel Resilience Party, and they were led by Benny Gantz, a former IDF chief of staff. And they were running together with a really small party called Telem, led by another former IDF chief of staff named Moshe Ya'alon. Now, all these parties, basically in both parties, Yesh Atid and Israel Resilience, they saw their leaders, or presented their leaders, as an alternative to Netanyahu. They wanted to be the main party running against Netanyahu, but they realized that if they're 2 sort of centrist parties on the Israeli political map, and they realized that they were sort of taking votes from the same pool, and that they would not get rid of Netanyahu in that way. So they decided to merge. And at first they were running on sort of a rotation, that if they won the election, one would be prime minister, and then a year and a half later, the other one would. And then eventually they dropped it. Gantz was more popular than Lapid. So they ran. Now, the half of the party, right, comes from Israel Resilience, which was a new party, which had merged with Yesh Atid so soon after it being born that they didn't even really have a platform. It wasn't so clear what they stood for. Now, Yesh Atid had a platform because they've been around for several years already, but they maintained a campaign of relative sort of vagueness throughout the past year. They did have a published platform that was based mostly on what Yesh Atid's positions have been, but on a lot of the biggest questions of the election, they wanted to draw in voters from right and the left, and so they didn't give the most solid answers. And when I get to the current negotiations that are happening, I'll explain in more detail sort of what that means. But the one issue that they really emphasized and they gave clear answers on is corruption and rule of law. They said firmly that they would not sit in a government when Netanyahu is prime minister, because Netanyahu has been accused of various charges of corruption, and he was indicted in the fall. And they said even though legally a prime minister can remain in office when he's been indicted, they think that sort of ethically, morally, it's wrong, and they're not going to sit in the government with him. And they really emphasized this point of corruption in their campaign. That was their big thing. And that was, we don't want Netanyahu to be prime minister. We believe Netanyahu is corrupt. Now, they managed to draw in a lot of votes from the Israeli left wing in that way, because the Israeli left wing wanted to get rid of Netanyahu, and they felt that a large blue and white was the way to do that. Which brings us to election number 3 of this crazy 3-election year. On election, after the votes were counted, Likud was the biggest party, and they had a fairly solid gap ahead of blue and white. However, there were only the parties that recommended Netanyahu as the candidate for prime minister only added up to 58. And all the rest of the seats in the Knesset, -1, recommended Gantz. Now, this left Gantz with 2 options, and both options would mean breaking a promise to his voters. So first, he could have formed what's called a minority government, which means a government that is made up of a minority of the seats in the Knesset, with outside support from the Joint List. Now, the Joint List is the mostly Arab bloc in the Knesset. It's a bloc that's made up of several Arab parties. When the electoral threshold was raised a few years ago, they decided to run together as one party, and they've actually grown over the years. They've become fairly popular. In the past, they would never recommend any candidate for prime minister. They only did it once, which was Yitzhak Rabin in the early 90s. But at this point, they so wanted to get rid of Netanyahu that they said they're going to recommend Gantz. And there were some things they didn't like so much about Gantz, but they said they'd recommend him anyway. Now, Gantz said throughout the election that he is not going to build a coalition that is based on the Joint List's votes. But after the election, his party did somewhat entertain it. And first of all, he got their recommendations. Without their recommendations, he wouldn't have been the candidate for prime minister. But also, some in his party tried to work on negotiations to build what would be called a minority government, as I said, and that the Joint List would vote with that government, but they wouldn't actually be members of government. Now, the understanding why they wouldn't be members of this government also explains to you why Gantz made an election promise that he wouldn't build a government that depended on them. See, the Arab parties in Israel have never been part of any governing coalition because they do not believe that it is legitimate for Israel to be a Jewish state. Now, and that's a ideological, philosophical thing. But beyond that sort of philosophical idea, many in the party, most I would say, support groups that physically attack Israel. Whether it's Hamas or whether it's Hezbollah, there are many, many of the Knesset members from the Joint List who have openly expressed support for these groups, which seek to kill Israelis, and that is anathema to many Israelis. And Likud and Netanyahu knew that, so they really emphasized in their campaign that Gantz can't form a government unless he relies on these people, and so that really actually hurt blue and white in their campaign. And in order to try not to be hurt by the Likud campaign, Gantz had promised that he would not be in a coalition with them. Now, it's not just the ideology of it, which is important to people, but many in blue and white thought that in practicality it wouldn't work, because in the Joint List, people said we can't support a government, for example, that would strike in Gaza. Now, we know why Israel has airstrikes in Gaza. It's when Hamas shoots rockets into Israel at Israeli civilian centers and you have people having to run into bomb shelters, then Israel strikes back. But there are Knesset members in the Joint List who believe that that's not legitimate and that Israel should just take it, and can't strike back when there are rockets. And you have a party, the Blue and White Party, which has 3 former IDF chiefs of staff in it, or had at the time. And these are not people who are going to take rocket attacks on Israel sitting down. So in practicality, it probably wouldn't have worked out. But that was the first option that Gantz could consider. The second option was to form a unity government with Netanyahu. Now, as I mentioned, their sort of biggest emphasis in their campaign was that they were not going to form a government with Netanyahu because they believe Netanyahu is corrupt. So that left Gantz with no options, really, no good options. As this coronavirus crisis broke out, I would say, I mean, look, coronavirus, it was happening and it had already reached Israel before the election took place. There were actually special polling places for people who were in quarantine. And you had people working in the Central Election Committee wearing, the PPE as they counted the votes. But it wasn't so huge and people weren't in lockdown, and the quarantines were only for people who were coming, say, from places with a lot of infections, which was, I think, China and Thailand at the time. But as the crisis deepened and got worse, Netanyahu started calling on Gantz to form what's called in Israel a unity government, where you have a government that's made up of people from sort of both sides of the political aisle. Gantz and Netanyahu started negotiating behind the scenes. But what was happening sort of in public, not behind the scenes, that the Knesset was inaugurated, it was sworn in, and members of Blue and White started doing things that were sort of hostile and antagonistic to Netanyahu. So they wanted to get rid of the Knesset speaker, who was sort of an interim Knesset speaker continuing from last time, who's from Likud party, and to install someone who was very hostile to Netanyahu. They wanted to take all the committee chairmen, who were, again, interim committee chairmen, who were, just have continuity from last time until new ones could be elected, and they were trying to replace them. And their argument was, well, 61 of us were against Netanyahu, so we're a majority and we can change these chairmanships. What normally happens is that these interim committees keep functioning sort of as interim committees, and people continue to maintain these interim jobs until a new government is formed, because you don't know what the coalition is going to be. But they were pushing forward full speed ahead to replace all these people who were in the pro-Netanyahu camp with people from the anti-Netanyahu camp. So you had these two opposite trends happening, where Gantz was negotiating with Netanyahu and his party was doing things against Netanyahu in the Knesset. And 2 weeks ago, there was going to be a vote for the new Knesset speaker, which there was a lot of drama about that, but again, we don't have time to get into every detail. But there was going to be a vote for a new Knesset speaker, and there was a truly surprising thing happened, which is that rather than the candidate that Blue and White had been talking about, who was hostile to Netanyahu, his name's Meir Cohen, Benny Gantz himself made himself a candidate for Knesset speaker. Now, you might say, why would he do that? He is a candidate for prime minister. Why would he want to be, the equivalent of Speaker of the House? So the answer is that he put himself there to be a placeholder. He put himself there to stop the hostile anti-Netanyahu moves so that negotiations between his party and Netanyahu could continue. And in one way it worked. The negotiations are ongoing. It's almost 2 weeks later. And in another way, he really suffered from it, because what happened on that day is that Blue and White split up. The other parties I had mentioned, Yesh Atid and Telem, they broke off from Blue and White, and they are now, if a unity government is formed, and that seems to be where we're moving towards, they're going to be in the opposition, and only Gantz's party, which was called Israel Resilience, but they got to keep the name Blue and White, even though the rest of Blue and White left. So Blue and White will be in the coalition with Netanyahu. So now coalition negotiations are happening, and they're based on a sort of guideline that Rivlin, the President Rivlin, had drawn up, which is not a usual thing for a president, but because Israel was so stuck and we were having repeat elections, he thought that this would be a way to get unstuck. So his suggestion was, first of all, that there be a rotation for prime minister. So part of the agreement is that Netanyahu will remain prime minister for another 1.5 years, and after that, Gantz will take his place. And the other part of these guidelines is that it will be a parity government, and that is P-A-R-I-T-Y, not P-A-R-O-D-Y, even though sometimes it feels like we have the second one. So in any case, the idea of parity in this situation means that the right and the center left will have an equal amount of seats in the cabinet. And that's even though at this point there are 58 pro-Netanyahu right-wing seats, and then there'll be another 17, I believe, 19 in the end. There'll be another 19 seats on the center left. So there's probably going to be a cabinet with 30 ministers, which is very large. It's large for Israel, and it's large compared to other countries in the world. And people there have a lot of complaints about that it's a waste of money in a time when our economy is not doing very well. In any case, almost all of the Knesset members from blue and white will now be cabinet members. They'll have very few who are functioning as lawmakers, because in Israel there's not like a full separation of the executive and the legislative branches. Whereas in Likud and Likud's partners, which are the ultra-Orthodox Shas and United Torah Judaism, and Yamina, which may or may not end up in the coalition, they're a far-right party, so they will all have, you know, functioning lawmakers in addition to members of cabinet, because they have far more seats in the Knesset. So the main sort of sticking points in the negotiations, because they've kind of agreed on the technical outlines of what the coalition would look like, are on policy at this point. So there's two big things. The first thing is about the legal system and rule of law issues. The right wing in Israel has very much opposes what's called judicial activism. And again, that's something I could talk about for like an hour, but to explain it in more American terms, the right's been trying to appoint more conservative judges. In Israel, politicians don't usually have a big influence on which judges are chosen, and they want politicians to have more of an influence on which judges are chosen, because they feel that the current system allows sort of a closed circle where judges only choose people who are ideologically similar to themselves. They sort of Netanyahu wants to have influence on who's going to be the justice minister and who's going to be the next attorney general. Gantz thinks that this is, even though the prime minister always has some level of influence on these things, Gantz wants to minimize Netanyahu's influence because Netanyahu, again, is under indictment on corruption charges. So they've had some back and forth, and in this case, Gantz is sort of winning. Netanyahu has veto power over who's going to be justice minister, but Gantz is really pushing this one candidate that he wants, which is someone who does not oppose judicial activism, does not have these sort of more conservative views on the judiciary. The other issue is the Trump peace plan. The Trump peace plan would allow Israel to apply its laws to 30% of the West Bank. That includes all of the Israeli communities in the West Bank, which are often called settlements, but also beyond that. And then the other 70% of the West Bank would become a Palestinian state. Now, when the plan was first released in January, Gantz spoke very enthusiastically about it, but he had a caveat. He said Israel could only proceed with these things if it has international support, and especially support from Israel's neighbors from Egypt and Jordan, because Gantz was concerned that this would ruin the peace plan, especially with Jordan. It seems that Netanyahu has sort of worn Gantz down on that front, and that while Gantz still doesn't really support settlement annexation, he won't, the coalition agreement will not give him veto power. And Netanyahu will likely have a majority of votes in the Knesset in order to push that forward, even if Gantz opposes it. So no coalition agreement has been signed yet, but it seems like we're very close to it. You know, at this point, it's the night before Passover, so probably it'll be a few more days because of the holiday, but it looks like Israel will finally have a government. Now, what I did mention was what pushed Gantz to do this, right? Gantz promised that he wouldn't sit in a coalition with Netanyahu, and then suddenly, about 2 weeks ago, he did the exact opposite of that. Now, what pushed him to it really is coronavirus. It's that there's a sense of a major emergency here in Israel. We're working with an interim government which legally could not break past certain budgetary limitations to give Israeli businesses and individuals the support that they need in this time of economic uncertainty. There is enough money sort of for the health system, and that's not an issue. The problem is additional money to give support for the non-health issues that are coming up because of this. And in general, people don't like that all this political bickering is going on when there's a life or death crisis happening. There's an idea that everyone should be united and do the work that's necessary so that we can get past this. And so the coronavirus seems to be pushing Israel towards finally breaking out of this never-ending election cycle and having a government. So that is what's happening in politics today. And I think I'm ready to take some questions. Alana, if you want to read to me some of the audience questions.
Thank you so much, Lahav. That was not an easy job to do, I am sure. It's got to be pretty challenging, as I'm sure all the people who are viewing us from around the world will agree. And who is watching, you may ask. You'll be interested to know that we have viewers tuned in from India, Trinidad, Hungary, Brazil, Denmark, Budapest, the Netherlands, Ireland, the US, the UK, Canada, and more. So we really have an international viewing audience who are all interested in your interpretation and your insights. And we do have some great questions for you. So Lahav, our first question is from Gary, and he asks, what happens to votes of parties that don't reach the threshold?
Those votes, I hate to say that they don't count, right? Because they count in this percentage of who gets in the threshold and who doesn't, but then that's it. I mean, if you voted for a party that didn't pass the threshold, then your vote is not represented in Parliament.
Okay, fantastic. We have another question here from Yosef, who asks, would the Israeli political system work better if it used the MMP, which is the mixed member proportional representation system that other countries use in the world?
I'm a little embarrassed. I'm not really sure what that means. If I had an example of what country that is, maybe I would know what that's talking about. But I could say that certainly there's been a lot of different proposals of how to change the Israeli system to make it more stable, to have governments last a longer time, whether it's to have sort of regional voting instead of one general section, to have maybe direct elections for prime minister, which is something that Israel tried in the 1990s. It didn't work out very well because a lot of times then you would have someone elected for prime minister, but they would have a very small party and then they wouldn't be able to really push anything through in parliament. But the issue is, in order to change the electoral system, you need broad support in parliament, and it's hard to get everyone to agree on it.
Okay, fantastic. And then the last question we have from Karen, who asks, do you think personally that the current situation under coronavirus will be too much of a challenge for succeeding in forming a government finally?
No, I actually think that the coronavirus crisis and how to handle it is something that the elements that are negotiating to form a government seem to agree on. That's really not the points that they're arguing about. And so I don't think that the coronavirus is a challenge. I actually think that it's really helping, and it's really pushing the sides together, because Gantz and Netanyahu both believe that this is a huge emergency and that we need stability and we need a strong government in order to tackle it.
Okay, great. So that is it from our viewers from today, the few questions that we can take in the short amount of time that we have. I want to thank Lahav so much for explaining the situation on the ground in such a turbulent and challenging time for Israel. Before we wrap up, I want to tell everybody that is watching us from around the world that if you love the work of Stand With Us, you can donate and support our work at www.standwithus.com/donate. Join us for our next webinar, which will be actually your chance to grill our experts. This is not something you get to do every day. So with over 40 years of collective experience in the field, they'll be tuning in to answer all of your tough questions, from the conflict to opportunities for peace and beyond. We are excited to be hosting Neil Lazarus, an internationally acclaimed expert in the fields of Middle East politics, public diplomacy, and effective communication, joined by Charlotte Korchak, the Senior Educator and Director of International Student Programs at Stand With Us Israel, and of course the wonderful Max Samarov, the Executive Director of Research and Strategy at Stand With Us. Our full program and all of the different things that we can offer through Stand With Us Connect can be viewed on our website at standwithusconnect.com, and we look forward to you joining us next time as well. If you can't come to Israel, we will bring Israel to you. I'm Ilana Sherrington-Hoffman, live from Israel for Stand With Us Connect. Shalom, and see you all next time.